For more now on that other big headline breaking today, outgoing Chief of Staff John Kelly giving that exit interview to the Los Angeles Times. As Jeff mentioned, one of the headlines, this statement on the border wall. To be honest, it's not a wall, Kelly said. A bit later in the piece, he's quoted saying, the president still says wall. Oftentimes, frankly, he'll say barrier or fencing. Now he's tended towards steel slats. But we left a solid concrete wall early on in the administration. Joining me now is Molly O'Toole, immigration and security writer for the LA Times, who interviewed John Kelly exclusively. Molly, great to have your perspective in here as you gather this information to share with us in this article. Let's start here with that wall quote. Immediately generating headlines, really, stood out to me upon reading it. In what spirit did he say that?
Well, we were having a sort of a larger conversation about some of the areas in which it seemed that there were distinctions between the positions of John Kelly and the president. And sort of before he joined, particularly the White House as chief of staff, as you know, he was Secretary of Homeland Security, and he had expressed some views on some of the key immigration and border security issues that the president had run and won on, had expressed some differences. And one of those was about the wall. You'll remember that John Kelly, rather early on, was sort of forced to walk back some comments in which he suggested that the president was evolving or learning on the wall issue because Kelly had talked to Customs and Border Protection, to Border Patrol agents who said, look, we don't need a 100-foot solid concrete wall. What we need is some combination of barriers in certain areas, technology, and more personnel.
Well, here's the thing. When it comes to reading that line, many are reading it and going, hey, I'm kind of thinking this is him pushing back on Trump's wall rhetoric. There's that interpretation. Is that your sense?
Well, I mean, we did talk about, to some extent, I referenced, of course, the shutdown and how it is primarily over the president's demands for this $5 billion for the border wall, and sort of this gap potentially between rhetoric and reality when it comes to some of these key issues. I think that probably John Kelly wouldn't suggest there's as much distance as it seems, but if the president is sort of clinging to this, frankly, his trademark of a wall, whereas others like Kelly and sort of Homeland Security professionals, border professionals on the ground are saying, well, it's not quite that, then it does suggest that there is this gap between rhetoric and reality, and it raises questions about what is politics and what is practical policy.
Yeah, and of course, the big question also is, during this entire time, what was it like there with the West Wing? We've heard that there all the expectations of him being the adult in the room, but then also there's this general chaos in the West Wing also that we've been hearing of. Did he leave that impression or reject it?
No, certainly left the impression, particularly at the beginning, that there was this chaos. I mean, the way that John Kelly frames his tenure, which clearly was rocky. I mean, there's lots of reports of, he called it palace intrigue, interagency rivalry. There were many reports of that were clear, some of which were contributed to by John Kelly. He's known for, being a pretty affable guy, but also having a pretty hot temper. But he made clear, at least at the beginning in particular, that there was no process in place really for briefing or informing the president, that the transition had been very chaotic, and he suggested that it had poorly served President Trump when he was making some of these key decisions at the beginning. Now, John Kelly will make the argument, sort of defend his tenure, that he brought in a process, he brought in order, and while people may not have always liked President Trump's decisions, he did his best to make them the best informed decisions that they could be. Now, I think other people would suggest that he was not successful at being the adult in the room because of the chaos that we continued to see. But John Kelly makes the argument that his job was not to make policy, but to implement the policy and inform the president as best he could.
And also what struck me when he says he defends that time measured by what the president did not do when Kelly was there at his side. What are examples of that?
Well, I think we can just sort of see, particularly in the past couple weeks, I mean, we saw the resignation, a much more public resignation. Kelly sort of kept his own counsel of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, particularly over the announcement, at least, of the decision to withdraw troops from Syria and withdraw a significant amount of troops in Afghanistan. And so I think if we sort of see the before and after, if Kelly discussed with the president on December 7th, it was announced on December 8th, that he was going to be resigning, and then a week later we see that that President Trump has made this announcement about troops in withdrawing troops in Syria, withdrawing troops in Afghanistan. I think that is a pretty good example potentially of what John Kelly and others prevented the president from doing.
You mentioned General Mattis. You can't help but compare, because you have General Mattis, who leaves his post with that scathing letter critical of the president, and then you've got General Kelly's approach. It seems tame by comparison. So do you think in essence there was any part of him that was holding back here? And is there an overall impression that he left you with about the president as a whole?
I mean, certainly describing working very closely with the president, sort of spending every waking minute of a 15-hour day with the president, and describing almost a sort of intimate relationship. Kelly has always sort of framed himself as the good soldier taking the orders from the commander-in-chief, even until the end, you know, perhaps despite personal sacrifice, or now his legacy sort of being very closely associated with some of the controversies of the Trump administration. But portraying himself as the good soldier, I don't think he would necessarily believe that it was appropriate for him to sort of make this public rebuke, especially having spent so much time with the president. And I do want to say that on many issues, even Kelly's defenders were surprised the degree to which he seemed fairly aligned with the president in a way that they didn't necessarily expect.
Yeah, interesting how you end your article saying, you know, for that 18 months with the policy clashes, the personality clashes, why do you stick around out of duty? Was it your sense that he liked the president?
I don't think the emphasis in the interview, at least, and I think we can see from Kelly's other comments, is basically that it wasn't about whether or not he liked the president. It wasn't about his personal opinions. It was about how he could best bring order to the White House and provide as much information as possible before the president made his decision. But then once he made that decision, it wasn't his role necessarily to question it, but to implement it. But others would suggest that that sort of military thinking maybe didn't serve John Kelly or the president in a way that it could have, because it's this idea of sort of following the chain of command. And, you know, many suggest that perhaps John Kelly should have stood up if there were disagreements that he had with the president on some of these most controversial issues, from the family separation to the travel ban when he was Homeland Security Secretary, and so on.
Yeah, as you write with what he said, that it was duty. Military people don't walk away. Fascinating read. Molly O'Toole, thank you for that.
Thanks.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.